We are doing Brachos Daf Chaf Beis, top 10 teachings on the Daf. We're going to begin with Rashi versus the Rambam on the reason why a Keri is forbidden, or was originally forbidden by the institution of Ezra to study the Torah. So we're going to learn a little bit in more detail when we do number 2, so just bear with me for that. But the basic concept is that there's a certain decorum, a certain seriousness in which one has to enter into studying Torah. And Keri is somebody who either he lived with his wife until he'll go to the mikvah. That kind of levity that he had, the fun that he had, something like that is what gets in the way of him being able to study Torah according to the institution of Ezra. Let's see what the Talmud says about that. Let's see what Rashi says, and let's see what Maimonides says as well. So the Talmud here says the following thing. Let's see where it says number 1. It's a quote in a Brisa. Titania v'hodaitim levenecha levnei benecha chsiv asrei yom asher amadat lefnei Hashem elokecha b'chorev. It says you should let your children and grandchildren know, meaning recount to them the event of receiving the 10 Commandments, and in fact the Torah as well, that was given to Moses during the 40 days and 40 nights at Sinai. And then it says, the day that you stood before God at Chorev, at Mount Sinai. Now we say, just like when we received the Torah, it was with fear and trembling and trepidation. So too, on a daily level, when one embarks on the pursuit of Torah, one has to do so with a sense of awe and grandeur. Mikan amru hazavim v'hamitzarayim ubayin al nidos mutarim likros b'torah v'nevim v'ksuvim. We say people who had certain things that would make them ritually impure are allowed to study Torah. However, aval bale kerian asurim, but people who had the normal emission of semen, which would have happened in the normal contact between a husband and wife in a marital relationship, or if somebody had it without actually being to get cohabiting with his wife, then it would be forbidden. And what would exactly be forbidden? There's a number of opinions of what part of Torah. Most of the rabbis don't think everything is forbidden. They just think some element of Talmud Torah, of study, is forbidden. And eventually this decree is going to be nullified. That's why you didn't hear about it, unless you're a scholar. Let's look and see what Rashi says. Rashi says, I've got the number 1 underline. Kol hatameim mutarim b'torah she'af hem yicholim lios be'ema v'reasas. Regular impure people can study Torah because they can be in a state of awe. Aval bale keri ena ela mitoch kalas rosh v'zachos hadas. But the Keri, he can't, because they're coming from a state of levity, a state of I don't want to say, it's not a word, depravity is not the word, because again, this could be a normal relationship between husband and wife, but that sense of kind of fun and abandon in their sexual interests somehow diverts them from the seriousness that's required to study Torah. And the way to press the reset button is to immerse in a mikvah. Or we're going to be introduced to the concept of a shower, which is the washing oneself off with 9 kavin, a certain measurement of water that's poured onto oneself, which is which is related to this concept of the mikvah. It's the Talmud discusses it in detail. Did it have anything to do with Ezra? Did it come later? But be that as it may, it does exist as something. So that is the Rashi. The thing is, if you study the Talmud goes on. I'm skipping ahead so that we can understand the context of the Rambam and why many people don't agree with the Rambam and they hold like Rashi. Later on, the Talmud is going to say that that there was some rabbis that would either tell their students or whisper to their students that they didn't have to go to the mikvah. Okay, so now the question is, why would they just not tell them? The Gemara discusses that, and the Gemara says the following: Manditani Laksha, the one who says that they just whispered it, Shalo Yehi Talmidei Chachamim Mitzuyun Eitel Nishosehen Kitar Negolim. The reason that the rabbis may have just whispered this law, that their students who were married did not have to go to the mikveh after they had marital relations before studying Torah, is they did not want their students to be with their wives like chickens. Apparently, I guess today when we talk about animals that have a lot of intercourse, people will refer to, let's say, a rabbit. Back then, for whatever reason, it was a chicken. I'm not an expert in animals in this regard. So Rambam actually quotes this as the reason why a Baal Keri, why a person in this circumstance needs to go to the mikvah. The question is very obvious. It's not this reason that's given is from the very rabbis who did not insist on their students going to the mikvah. They actually felt their students did not have to go to the mikvah, but they didn't want to announce it because they wanted to kind of balance out the need for people to study with the need for people not to spend too much time with their wives in a way that they felt was inappropriate. So one way to explain the Rambam is that although they were nullifying they were blunting the teeth of the decree, they agreed to some degree with the purpose of the decree, which is that a man shouldn't be with his wife too much. Why? That would actually be a lishitasa. That would follow the Rambam, for example, when it comes to kedoshim to you, to be sanctifying oneself. Maimonides is very into this idea of separating oneself from overly indulging in sexual relations, even in permitted sexual relations. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that you can't have relations with one's wife. It just means not to overindulge in it. So in that sense, the Rambam would fit in with that. The question is, why doesn't he learn like Rashi and just say that a certain levity that happens, and that we'll address a little bit of that in number 2. What is number 2? Number 2 is the idea of standing before Sinai. The rabbis, in one way or another, both on 21 and 22, use verses about standing in front of Sinai. On 21, they actually try to say, just like when we stood at Sinai, there was a period in which the men separated from the women and went to the mikvah. The men and the women went to the mikvah, for that matter, to prepare for the receiving of the Torah. so too we don't have to separate from our wives for 3 days, like the Torah mentions, but we have to at least go to the mikvah after a man has been with his wife before studying Torah. Now, our page doesn't have that way of learning, kind of that concrete way of learning that's exact parallel. Here it's more the underlying principle, which is in order to receive Torah, we need to create a boundary, so to speak, around the mountain, not just a physical boundary, not to go up the mountain, which was prescribed in the Torah, very clearly in Parshas Yisro. In addition to that, a man and woman couldn't be together because it was almost as if we were indulging ourselves in the regular sensual things that a man and woman do together. It's as if that would blunt our spiritual sense of quieting the mind down to experience the most intense, mind-blowing spiritual awakening that the universe has ever experienced, the receiving the Torah. So it's like anything. If you want to be able to hear something, you have to quiet down. You have to stop overloading sensory things. That's why, for example, on Shabbos, when we disconnect and unplug from the usual electronic devices that we have during the 6 days of the week, that silence creates the space to feel the holy. And that might be the same kind of ongoing thing that we want when we are studying Torah. We want to feel close to God, and there's a give and take, a tug of war between taking care of the needs of one's body, one's desire, and quieting that down enough to be able to enter into a spiritual relationship with God. Okay, that's number 2. We move on to number 3, which is ultimately these concerns are rejected by Rabbi Yehuda ben Besiera. The story is that there was a student that see number 3. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda ben Besiera haya omer ein divrei Torah mikablan tuma. Rabbi Yehuda ben Besiera says that the words of Torah do not become impure. And then it tells a story with a student that was either reading the words very quickly, not enunciating them properly, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Besiera said, "Son, my child, open your mouth and let your words be illuminated," like meaning say them clearly, articulate them, because the words of Torah do not receive tuma. Like it says, "Halo kod divrei ka'esh ne'um Hashem." You see, I think the mistake became that studying Torah somehow, in a sense, when the person had an element of ritual impurity that would normally only affect the Kohen, eating certain foods, having to go to the mikvah before nightfall and then being able to eat those foods again that are uniquely set aside for the Kohen. For Israelite, there was beginning to be this perception that Torah somehow becomes impure by the person who has this slight level of ritual impurity of Keri. There is a beautiful source that I saw, I don't remember who says it, that Rabbi Yehuda ben Besiera was saying that the Torah is like black fire on white fire. It's like fire. Fire doesn't receive ritual impurity because it's not a thing. It's not an object. Objects become ritually impure. Fire does not. So in a sense, Torah is fire. It's not an object, and therefore it doesn't take on this ritual impurity by the person who's a Keri. Eventually, the Gemara is going to say that the rabbis nullified the decree of Ezra. That's number 4, and let's look at that inside. Number 4 is Ki asa ze'iri amar batluha l'tvilusa. The sage named Ze'iri said they nullified this whole concept And there's going to be discussion whether that means they nullified it 100% or 90% or something like that. But this concept of going to the mikvah, they nullified it. So the question is, how do you nullify something that, especially a great sage like Ezra, instituted? How do you nullify something like that? So just to quote, there's a lot of commentary on that. I'm just going to use a likut called the Yosef Das, who addresses things. I've seen this in other svarim as well. It's not unique to the Yosef Das, but I got to read it from somewhere. So, in general, there's a principle, and it's most of this is that a beis din cannot nullify, they can't overturn the words of a prior beis din unless it's greater than it, both numerically and also in wisdom. And the claim isn't here that they were greater than the beis din of Ezra. The claim rather is that the institution, the name of a takana, the takana means a enactment. The enactment that Ezra put into place never spread enough to the majority of Israel. And the concept is that when the rabbis make a takana, if it doesn't catch on, if the majority of people don't follow it, then at some point the rabbis can officially say this enactment is void because it wasn't followed. There's a lot of questions on this. One question is, by the time of the Mishnah, we're talking about 500 years after Ezra, the Gemara 700-800 years after Ezra, when the Tanaim and Amoraim are talking about this. It's a long time after Ezra. It seems like a long time for them to say, well, this hasn't really caught on, let's nullify it. What about all those hundreds of years where it didn't catch, yet many people kept it? I think that's a great example of how halacha works. A lot of people see. Here's the deal. I'm supposedly a rabbi. I say supposedly because I am not always the greatest rabbi, but still supposedly a rabbi. So I struggle with that. But a lot of rabbis are very book oriented, which means they know what the Sefer says, they know what the book says, and based on what the book says, they literally want to follow the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch to implement every written rule as if it's codified in the Talmud, in the code of law, and therefore we should do them all. The truth is that in my opinion, and other great, I'm nothing and nobody, but people like Rav Moshe Feinstein explain that you need to be aware of the minhag. You need to be aware of the custom. In fact, I think there was one rabbi that says we live in an orphan generation. I think he was critiquing a particular, more contemporary version of the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Everybody reads and thinks they have to follow because it's written in it. But in fact, you have to know if you come from a religious community, learn the customs of your community. They're of great importance and significance, often much more than what's written in the book. We say Maisa Rav. We say, what's the story of what a Rav in the Talmud, or a rabbi in general of great renown, what is their practice? That's more valuable than what's written in the book. So, however, I'm going to say there's certain things that arguably they're not right away disqualified because they didn't catch on within a year or two or three. They may last 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 years in a kind of let's see if this catches. And ultimately, if it doesn't catch, and the rabbis say, there's a reason this isn't catching. In this case, it's a big burden for people to have to go to the mikvah if they're a Keri. we're going to undo this. There's a good reason to undo it, even though Ezra had the best of intentions. We're going to undo it. So that's a little bit of a more broad conversation about the place of the written word versus the minhag Yisrael, the customs of Israel. There's a lot of things in halacha that, by the way, many communities do not practice. Today also, there's a lot of people in the yeshiva world have taken upon themselves new chumras. They're always looking to learn a Gemara, and the Rosh Hashiva gives a shir. I've been to shirim like that, where the Rosh Hashiva comes out with a kiddush that new halachas, of new hanhagas, will be created. And it's very sweet, but it's not my way, because there's plenty of halachas. We shouldn't be searching to create new chumras all the time, but some people, for them, that's how they enhance their Torah, their relationship with God, and it's a beautiful thing for them. The problem is, when does their chumrah become Klal Yisrael's burden? And arguably, we should say that their chumrah should be their personal chumrah, maybe of that person, maybe that Rosh Hashiva, maybe some of his top Talmidim. Even in many of the great Gedolei Yisrael had the psak halacha of what they considered the halacha, and then they had certain hanhagas which they understood were more on the level of a personal chumrah, and that's something that needs to have further discussion of distinguishing between a psak halacha for Klal Yisrael and a personal chumrah, or a chumrah for the Talmidim that are closest and dearest to you. So that's part of a broader conversation. We'll continue to do that. The thing is, it is hard to just dismiss anything once it's written, and that could be why, since this institution of Ezra was widely known, although it wasn't widely practiced, it took them that long to kind of formally dissolve it. Okay, that was number 3. No, that was number 4. There's more to say about that, but that's a little bit about a very important topic. Number 5 is about the idea that not only was there the immersion in the mikvah that could purify oneself from the Baal Keri, when that was the custom and the practice for many, or encouraged for everyone, although it wasn't kept by everyone. There's also this institution of having 9 kavim of water poured on you. So it's number 5. The Gemara says, Taner Abana Baal Keri Shadasan Olav Tisha Kavin Mayim Tahar. A Baal Keri that had 9 kavim of water poured on themselves is tar. By the way, I realized I made a mistake when I was studying number 1 with you. I quoted some of this Gemara. I said that there was a debate about if the rabbis whispered or told people they didn't have to go to the mikvah. It wasn't that they didn't have to go to the mikvah. It's correct. They didn't have to go to the mikvah, but they still had to do something else in its place, which was to have 9 kavin of water poured upon the person, but not the actual mikvah. Meaning the rabbis downgraded the requirement of having to go to the mikvah, and you could, in effect, have something like a shower and clean yourself. So just to point out, there's an extended conversation, and this has impact even today. People who want to go to the mikvah for men today, there's a concept of going to a not kosher mikvah, meaning like going into a swimming pool, and it's based in part on this Gemara. It's not perhaps the original, it's not clear when these kind of leniencies crept in, but the biggest leniency, other than the nullifying the thing completely, was this idea of having 9 kavin of water, which is not that much water. It's probably a few minutes, two minutes in a shower. I've heard some people say it's longer. I don't think it's that much, depending on the water pressure. You could. That's just a mathematical equation you can do. It stand under the shower for a couple minutes, and you have the 9 kavim poured on you. And so again, there's a Brisker Torah is about the differences between before you have a Brisker Torah, the Gemara itself, you don't need to be a Brisker to say, there was a rabbi sitting in water and he had 9 Kavin poured on him, and the students said, you're sitting in more than 9 Kavin, why bother? Why don't you just dunk in that? Why do you need to pour 9 Kavin on you? He said, well, either you're sitting in a mikvah of 40 sauh, which I guess the bathhouse he was sitting in was not 40 sauh, or you have 9 Kavin poured on you. It's one or the other. It's either you immerse in 40 sauh, or the 9 Kavin are poured on you. It's the 9 Kavin is not a magical number to immerse yourself in. It's to pour yourself in. The magical number for immersion is 40 sauh. And on that, there's the Brisker Torah about the difference between the 40 sauh, even if it's not in a kosher, even if it's in a pit, even if the water isn't naturally like rainwater, things like that, even if the water was transported there using a kli, a vessel, would still be kosher, the Gemara says, for this type of mikvah immersion, even though it's not a real kosher mikvah. And that's what the Brisker Torah is about, is that it's, even though it's not a kosher mikvah, there's not like perhaps the objective mikvah, but there's a maisa of tefillah. There's an act of immersion in what's like a mikvah, even though there's some incidental element that disqualifies it from technically being kosher. So that is number 5. With that, we're going to move on to now I didn't do something very important in number 5. I found something fascinating about how an idolatrous practice influences us in this area. I found it quoted in the Shita Mikubetzes. The Shita Mikubetzes is a fantastic sefer written by Rabbi Betzal Ashkenazi, who was the teacher of the Arizal, amongst his most famous student, who supposedly, according to some, the Arizal actually helped Rabbi Betzal Ashkenazi with the Shita Mikubetzes on, I believe, Nadarim. That's what I've heard. Although I mentioned that to Moshe Idel, and he didn't find that so credible, but it's definitely brought down in I don't know. I didn't show him all the footnotes on it, but there's definitely a discussion about that I've seen in academic work as well. So what does this Shita Mikubetzes say? So what he says is that there's a book called the Pardes Rimonim, not to be confused with the most famous book of Ramosha Cordovero of the same name. But guess what? This Pardes Rimonim is attributed to Rashi and to others, but like the most significant of its authoritative figures, and it is Rashi. They quote his responsa there, and they quote other sages of Ashkenaz. So this is like a 12th or 13th century work. Almost no one's familiar with it today, including me for the most part. And in this work, he says something very fascinating. He says the reason why I continue to do 9 Kavin, which I guess is 12th, 13th century, and I don't believe it's Rashi that he's quoting. There's some other rabbi that he's quoting, I believe, an acronym that I'm not sure who. I don't know how to. I don't know who it is. But he says the following thing. He says, we continue, a Keri should go to the mikvah today because it's a kiddush Hashem, it sanctifies God's name. Because idolaters will, and he quotes a Gemara, I believe in Avodah Zarah, that says idolaters will not go into their house of worship without the equivalent of a shower of water being poured on them if they had a seminal emission. And if they know that Jews don't care about this, to them, that's terrible. That's like a desecration of God's name. So this is a wild concept that we would actually follow a practice that idol worshipers do so that they don't think any less of us. Now, let me explain to you why that's not really a problem. I know I made it sound like we're following an idolatrous practice. No. The answer is we have a precedent of our own of tahara, of purity when it comes to Torah and tefillah. And I was going to do a whole one of these things on that. There's a whole Gemara and Rishonim and Achronim that talk about the Baal Keri for tefillah, like that was a later based in the time of the rabbis that enacted this stringency of going to the mikvah even for prayer, not just for Torah. But since we already have the concept of ritual purity, and Ezra and then later rabbis instituted it for Torah and tefillah, it's not like we are just simply following whatever idol worshippers do, whatever they think is good, we should do it. It's simply because we had a practice that had, in theory, fallen by the wayside, and we're not required to do it, according to this very interesting commentary. This. Let me see what the name of. The Pardes, the Sefer Hapardes leRashi. According to this commentary within it, we continue to observe this custom so that we're not seen in a way as degrading our own religion. It's a fascinating thing. I know that there's I'm a big fan of the Mashiach. So one of the things so a lot of people don't want to acknowledge any kind of, one of the biggest kind of divides between Orthodox Judaism and conservative and Reform Reconstructionist Judaism, and this you'll often hear, and I'll add my voice to this, is that when you, and I've had, great relationships with non-Orthodox rabbis, and I've actually heard this from a conservative rabbi said, I think that this conservative rabbi said that 90 whatever percent of Judaism is influenced by surrounding cultures. And then I had a discussion with a Rosh Hashiva, right, like a very black hat Rosh Hashiva, who we're talking about if there's ever any kind of, I don't want to even use the word influence, but there's, I don't remember the exact words. And this Rosh Hashiva was insisting that there's zero influence. So you've got, on the one hand, and then I actually quoted I was quoting, and he didn't like anything I said until eventually I quoted something, and he's like, okay, fine. But on the simple level, you have this thing where the kind of the academic world, which the conservative Reform Reconstructionist rabbinical schools have more of a kind of like overall like adaptation to that world, although they're not necessarily equal and the same, is always looking for parallels between different religions. The Orthodox world, by and large, shuns it. Of course, within the modern Orthodox world, you have some pretty serious academic scholars, and that's where you get into interesting discussion about kind of balancing this concept of Torah Sinai and influence from other religions and cultures. So what I want to share with you is the Mashiach. I have a lot to talk about in this area, but because I think there's only a few rabbis who have dealt with this issue in a way that can reconcile Torah Sinai and also kind of learning history, not being afraid of history. And a few of the rabbis that I know of are the Meir Shiloach and the Shem Shmuel and rabbis like that. So also the Gemara, by the way, there's many Gemaras that when you learn them, you see certain things in this area. You see a lot of insight in this area. But anyway, the Meir Shiloach says there's certain stringencies that the Jewish people have taken on because we don't want to be seen by our non-Jewish neighbors as being lackadaisical or lewd. So, for example, one might be that in Christian countries, Jews have given up on the concept of polygamy. We've starting with Rabbeinu Gershon, but really much before that, but then becoming majorly codified with the cherem, the ban on marrying more than one woman by Rabbeinu Gershon. So I'm not suggesting that we're ever going to go back to having more than one wife, although I believe there might have been a famous rabbi about 100 years ago who was asked, when Mashiach will come, will we have more than one wife? And he says, yeah, very possible. So who am I? So my opinion doesn't count for much, but I'm pretty much of the opinion that we're going to probably continue to have one wife. But the point that I'm trying to bring out here is that the Mei Shiloh says that there are certain influences that because we're living in the world that we're living in, we will be seen, we will be misunderstood if we followed what the Torah originally said. So this concept that I'm quoting from the Sefer Hapardes that's associated with Rashi and his contemporaries can be understood in that light, meaning we had a requirement to pour the 9 Kavin on us from the time of the Amoraim, possibly even the Tanaim. And now we continue to do it in part because we don't want there to be a Chil Hashem from non-Jewish idol worshippers who would think it's terrible that we wouldn't do something like that. So it's just fascinating, another fascinating concept here in the Daf. We continue with number 6. 6 is also a great story, very weird and fascinating story. Number 6 is the following. Okay, here it is. The Tanya, Maisa be'echad shetava isha ledvar aver. There's a story with a man who was seducing a woman. He wanted to sleep with her. Now, it's not clear. Is this woman a married woman, a single woman? It doesn't say. Rashi says she was a single woman. Other commentators disagree. Amra, so she said, Amra Lai, this word I can't read because it's blocked. I unfortunately, Amalai, Reka. Oh, Reka means like low life. Yesh lecha arbayim sauh sha'ata tovel behen. Do you have a mikvah? Do you have access to a mikvah? 40 said that you're going to go into the mikvah. Miyad Pirish, right away he stopped bothering her, and she was free from his sexual advances. So a lot of the commentators ask a question. She's either a married woman, so this is either going to be a pretty serious thing, or she's not married, but it's still much more serious, especially according to the Rambam, who's serious in that area, than simply the need to go to the mikvah, and yet that's what got him to stop bothering her. That's how she kind of convinced him that it wasn't a good idea because of a custom to go to the mikvah. So it's not such a problem for Rashi. It's a problem for the other commentators that say she was married, and the only way she could convince him to leave her alone was this is not for her to go to mikvah. This is for him to go to the mikvah because he was a Torah scholar, presumably, and it would stop him from studying Torah. So it reminds me of when I went to Nepal. I once went to Nepal to help the Chabad Seder there. They have a Seder for 1,000 people. It's truly a phenomenal, almost life-changing experience to be at that Seder, definitely to participate in helping to organize it. And so one of the things I remembered in Nepal is that everybody's coming from different places. So I had, at that time in my life, I was young, I was like 21 years old, I had a lot of chumras that I would do. I still have quite a few of them, but even more than of stringencies I had, my family had adopted in terms of Pesach, of not eating many things that were technically kosher for Pesach. And when I got there, it's very hard to eat. There on Pesach, we brought a lot of food with us. We created a makeshift kitchen, and I gave myself certain leniencies in a number of those chumras. And I had the following observation, which was that Baruch Hashem, I kept all the laws of Pesach that I required, and if there was anything I broke, there were some chumras, and even the chumras I broke were not like the more serious, widely done chumras. I didn't even have to have kidneys there or anything. But the point is that when you're challenged, when you're in a challenging place like Nepal for Pesach, the fact that you're usually more from than you need to be, that acts as a buffer. That acts as like so you did away with the chumrah, but you still kept the etzem halacha. So perhaps this woman reminded this man that usually he was a very strict man. He would go to the mikvah, which is a chumrah. It might have not been a chumrah in that day because it depended on the generation of when now it's a chumrah, then it's not a chumrah. But let's just say it was a chumrah. And yet it stopped him to do the sin. So that's the importance. Sometimes the chumrah gets in the way of the etzem thing. Sometimes the chumrah acts as a buffer. So that's my little Torah on number 6. Number 7 is the 9 Kavin versus the 40 sauh of the mikvah, pouring versus immersing. And I really talked about that because I got confused when I talked about number 5, showering, the 9 Kavin, the influence of the idolaters. I mistakenly began half of that with talking about what was really necessary in the 9 Kavin versus the 40 sauh of the mikvah. So I really covered that. So refer back to number 5 to get that. Number 8 is today, chassidim and some misnagdim go to the mikvah. The question is, why do they go to the mikvah? Now, I can't speak for misnagdim, but I could speak for chassidim. I could definitely speak for Chabad chassidim. They don't go to the mikvah because of Tfilas Ezra. That is not why they're going to the mikvah. Is there some little remnant of Tfilas Ezra? Maybe, but that's not like it's not well known or thought about as like, oh, they're going to the mikvah because they're a Bal Keri, and the reason why they go every day is because it's embarrassing if you would only go on the day that you are a Bal Keri. Everybody would look at you, what happened? What did you do? So therefore, they go every day. That's brought down in halacha, that they're still accustomed to go to the mikvah for a Bal Keri, and the best way to avoid looking to be embarrassed is to go every day. That's not why chassidim, definitely not Chabad chassidim. They go for tahara. They go into the mikvah. I remember when I was once in Chabad yeshiva in Morristown, New Jersey, there was an elder chassid by the name of, I'm forgetting his name, but he was a very special man. And I asked him about why it's so important to go to the mikvah today. And I'll always remember, his face lit up and he said with great joy, he said, "A mikvah is dachalakus," which means a mikvah is godliness. And it left, I don't go to the mikvah now every day, but for the next year, it left a big impression on me, this idea that a mikvah is godliness. That's why chassidim go to the mikvah. Maybe godliness sounds like people, this person turned out to be a big Meshachist, but before he thought the Rebbe was Mashiach, he thought going to the mikvah was godliness. So but you know what? I could see why certain people are extreme because it works for them. So this fellow was very inspiring. He's a really sweet Jew, and to him, entering into the mikvah is the closest thing you could get to divine communion. It's a very beautiful thing. So for chassidim today, going into the mikvah is communion. I would hope misnagdim, the few that do go to the mikvah every day, also have the same thing in mind. My guess is a lot of them also think they're really doing Tfilas Ezra because there's a chumrah. The Tosos brings down, there's a Tosos here on Chaf Beis Amud Beis that says, V'les hilchas hakavasei the tefillah b'chol yom abraham sauh alafilu acherim. Now that's not what I wanted to see. So he says, Besiera, the Amar de Vitar and Mikal Tuma, V'yesh Mefarshim Dafka L'Torah of L'Tfila Tzarech Tvila, L'Tfila Tzarech Tvila, which means that some people say, well, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Besiera, that you don't have to go to the mikvah, and also, as we said, the Tfilas Ezra is batal. But Tosfos brings down that some people say that that's only for Torah, but when it comes to tefillah, davening, you still need Tfilas Ezra. Again, almost no one holds that that's a halacha today, but there's a lot of things that say it's definitely a minhag tov. It's a very good minhag. It purifies. There are things that it purifies you. It helps you remember your Torah. I even heard somebody say on the YU Torah website that I don't know who he was quoting, that only the people who wrote Svarim that go to the mikvah every day, their Svarim became like widely accepted. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's interesting. So that's a little bit about going to the mikvah today. There might be different reasons. I think some people think it's just part of a remnant of Tfilas Ezra, and that's their motivation. And other people just think it's for tahara. And some extremists, like my Chabad friend, think a mikvah is a lakus, which is very impressive. And by the way, in Chassidus, a mikvah represents the Sov of Kol Almin, the transcendent worlds. Like it says, like the Rambam likes to quote the prophets that say, "Amala arzdeis Hashem kamayim li'amachasim," that when Mashiach will come, the earth will be filled of God consciousness, the way the seabed is covered by the ocean floor. But there's something about being surrounded by the water in the mikvah that transcends all the levels of what's higher and what's lower, and kind of not just washes the person clean, but purifies them from beginning to end. So that's a little bit about mikvah today, the customs of going to the mikvah today. Number 9 is a little bit about davening, when you need to repeat it and not. And that's based on the Gemara here on the bottom of Chaf Beis, Amud Beis, and it says the following thing. If one is... Okay, well, the context is, this Mishnah is still talking a little bit about Keri, who's in the mikvah, and it's time for reading the Shema, and then that takes us into, it's talking about dirty water and so on and so forth, and then it moves on from there to excrement. And there's a concept of V'haya machanecha kadosh. Your camp should be holy, which means you can't pray when there's defecation, when there's excrement in your vicinity that you could smell or see, because that's not congruous with the kavanot of getting connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Gemara has a whole discussion about this, and in the beginning it seems to say, just move away, move to the side, move in the front, but like as if you could continue davening. But then the Gemara asks, and at one point it says, well, it can't be by your side, has to be way behind you, and yet on another place it says it could be on your side. And the Gemara says, well, that's when you move it all the way behind you, meaning you move ahead of it. But then the question is, the Gemara says, Haya mispalo matzah tzavim kamo. If you were praying and then you found excrement in the place that you were praying, amaraba alfi shechata, although you sinned, the commentators are going to say, what sin did you do? Because you were praying in a place where it's common for excrement to be. Let's say there was like a baby in a diaper. The baby in the diaper was like, you're holding the baby in the diaper, and then you finish praying and you realize, like, oh, that smell, yeah, that was a big diaper doo-doo that the baby had. But even though you sinned, because you should have checked, you should have put the baby in the other room or whatever it is, tefillah, your prayer is a prayer. So the question is, maskif la rava v'hazevach rishayim ta'eva. It says that the offering, and we know that prayer is in part in the place of an offering, or as the Rambam says, in the time of the offering, meaning we deduce time scheduling things. But even according to the Rambam, there's an element of the carbon in the tefillah that we learn in other respects. So the offering of a wicked person is an abomination. So if you were wicked enough not to care, you have this baby in front of you, and you're like, whatever, you know the baby might have pooped, and you don't bother caring and checking, then you should have known better. Ella Amar Rabba Hayel v'chata afa bishis bal tefillah. Even though he sinned, because he should have checked, and he prayed in that state, his prayer is a to'eva. And many commentators say that means you should go and pray again. Others say that, and so it's a contradiction. In one place, you don't have to repeat what you already said. And one of the answers to reconcile the contradiction is simply, if it's a place that is unusual for there to be excrement there. So, for example, if you were praying on the street, and you prayed in a place where, let's say in France, there's poop. I don't know. I think it's gotten better, but it used to be like, I don't know. People weren't necessarily cleaning up after your dog. So if you went and you didn't look around, you're praying in France, in a city that doesn't. I hope I'm not insulting the country, but I think things have gotten better. But it used to be like nobody really cared if your dog pooped. Nobody. A lot of people didn't pick it up. I think they've changed. Okay, but in the olden days, when I was a young kid, they used to poop. The dogs would poop, and they're all over the place. So if you didn't check, then you should pray again. But if you were in Paris, where they do pick it up, and you prayed in the street, and then there was poop. I mean, maybe not the street, but if you're in your house, and your house is clean, usually there's no poop in your house. But it turned out that somehow a friend's dog came and pooped in the corner, and you didn't see it. Then how would you know to even look? And therefore, you don't have to pray again. There's more to say about this. There's more to say about this, where there's like, you could, there's a concept of the chefza of tefillah. There's like, you could have done the act of prayer, but the objective prayer criteria wasn't met, but yet the act was met. That could be one way of explaining why, even if, according to the opinion that says that even if the tefillah is a to'eva, you still don't have to pray again, because you prayed, you did the act of praying, even though there was something wrong with it, you still did the act of prayer. That's more of the Rabbi Soloveitchik type of thing. And finally, last but not least, number 10 is really part of number 9, connected to number 9, which is finding an appropriate place to daven with babies and diapers in the background. Which really what we need to do is kind of like we were talking about. If you do have a baby, you shouldn't be praying with a baby, that you're holding or right in front of you, if the baby often poops, because there's a good chance that the baby did poop, and one has to use seichel when praying, being aware of one's surrounding. I'll just conclude with the story of the Alter Rebbe. It's not just about praying, guarding your prayer. It's also a little bit about being aware of where your little kids are at. One time, the Mittel Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe's son of Chabad, was in the middle of prayer, and one of his kids was crying and crying and crying and crying. But he was so immersed and deep in his prayer that he didn't hear him and didn't pick him up. And the grandfather of the crying baby came and picked up the baby and comforted the baby and took care of the baby. And when his son, the Mittel Rebbe, was finished praying, he said, when we pray, even though you're supposed to have kavanah, it shouldn't take us to the place where we don't hear the crying baby. We still have to hear the crying baby. So that's like a chassidic tale, which is not, of course, we have to make sure we pray in the proper place, but also, do we still hear the cries of a baby when we're praying? Thank you for watching.